Hello, Christian Colin wins. Today I'm going to be talking about post-Civil War speeches on the emancipation narrative. And the first thing we're going to be talking about are the primary sources that I used. The first primary source I used was the Gettysburg Address, which subtly hints at the emancipation, a little bit. Not a crazy important document, but it was the first time Lincoln kind of mentions it. As you were aware of, we chatted about this, and some people know about Lincoln before the Civil War wasn't really an emancipationist. In fact, you could argue that he was just as racist as the South in a lot of ways. But as the war progresses, it seems that he somewhat changes, and this becomes most evident in my main primary document, which is Lincoln's last public address. Now, the last public address is unique because arguably it's why Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. Within this last speech, which is not really talked about much in history books or textbooks or any of that, he talked about a path to citizenship for Black Americans. It talked about how the Civil War was a moot point. It was completely useless if there was no change that actually happened afterwards. And he talked about he talked about how it would be critical for schools to integrate. And think about how absurd that is. You're talking about post-Civil War in the South integrating schools. That wouldn't even become a thing until 80 to 90 years later. So that's why this document is so important, because Lincoln was essentially bringing up a revolutionary idea that was totally foreign and alien to your average American at the time. Integration was not something even remotely considered by people in the South. And in the end, it's essentially what Lincoln died for. And along the way, relative to the research, it was a really fascinating process because I started off by examining speeches in the North and speeches in the South post-Civil War. And come to find out, no one talks about emancipation. Everyone was afraid to touch it with a 10-foot stick. All these speeches were about bravery, masculinity, and suddenly the Civil War and what it represented was not a war for emancipation. In fact, that wasn't even considered a factor anymore. It was a test of freedom and manhood between the North and the South in glorious conflict. And you see this repeated over and over and over again in speeches from the North and South. And that's what surprised me. I thought people in the North, their speeches post-Civil War, would talk about emancipation, but instead neither side wanted to talk about it. And largely what I discovered was both sides were afraid of stirring up sectionalism in the South. And so that's why Lincoln and his last public address is a critical primary source document, because it's a huge piece of history that was advocating for something so important that no one else was willing to touch on. Thank you, Christian Colin Wins, for listening to me. Have a nice summer.
Okay, so unlike Carter doing post-Civil War, I did pre-Civil War, specifically the nullification crisis of 1828 to 1832. A little background on the nullification crisis. In 1828, Congress decides to impose a tariff on imports to the South, mostly including wool and cotton, which they import a lot of wool to clothe slaves and themselves as well, and then cotton obviously is their biggest commodity. So in the midst of this, Andrew Jackson is the president. The South had elected Andrew Jackson, who was from South Carolina, to be president with the intention of changing the tariff to be less, to not hurt the Southern economy as much as it was. So they elect him into office, hoping that they see change. In office, Andrew Jackson realizes that the South is threatening to secede. Specifically, South Carolina was where the majority of the crisis was. So realizing that the Union could break up, he decides to not revoke the tariff or lighten it at all to start with. He instead decides to do everything that he can to preserve the Union over everything. So amidst this, he's writing to his future vice president. At the time he was president, his first vice president was John Calhoun, and then later Martin Van Buren is who he writes to explain what's going on. So he starts with explaining a little background on the crisis, and then he goes into just basically explaining how urgent and pressing of a matter this is, and he goes to explain how South Carolina is on the brink of secession from the Union, and how they have raised 12,000 men to protect them from the crisis. And so Jackson decides to respond. He's trying to raise around 100,000 men to stop this from happening. So in this letter, he's telling Van Buren about his plans to raise the men and seek Congress to stop South Carolina from seceding. And I think this letter, gives context to the president's role in crises like this. And I think it was interesting for me. I learned how narrow of a line the president has to walk between seeming like a tyrant in imposing all the laws himself, and then also he doesn't want to seem like he's not doing anything by not taking action. So it's a really interesting source, and I learned a lot about the president's role and about the nullification crisis in general. So.
Okay. Whoa, it's a weird chair. Okay. I did my research on the 1920 Duluth lynchings. My primary source was actually a photograph taken after the lynchings occurred. The lynchings happened during, I believe, spring of 1920, and it was with two high school students who were 18 and 19 at the time, one white male and one white female, and they went to a one-day circus that was in town, and they somehow ended up in the back of the circus watching African-American men like load the docks and like load the trucks for the next ship and take down the tent and everything. And later that night, the 18-year-old male had told his father that his girlfriend at the time was raped and robbed by some of the men, and he was also like assaulted. So then the police chief actually lined up like 150 black men and told them to choose like 6 of them, and they just kind of randomly chose. And later that day, there was actually somehow the news got a hold of the story and publicized it, which caused a lot of conspiracies to go around the town, and all the black men didn't really have like a fair trial or anything. So later that night, a mob formed outside the Duluth prison, and they broke down the jail doors, the windows, and everything, and the chief of police ordered that the police not use weapons against the mob, so they failed in protecting the black prisoners. The mob was able to open 3 cells, and it was of 3 African-American men, who they later lynched, and they decided they found guilty themselves. So there was actually a photo taken after the lynching, and there was 2 men in the background hanging and 1 on the floor dead. The reason the photo was so shocking to America was because that it was so far north, and also all the mob members were very proud. They looked very proud of what they had done. It even shows that, it was even said that cars were used to light the photo. So the photo later became a postcard, and it sparked like controversy all over the nation. Some people were like for the mob and some were against. So this made a big issue. I'm trying to think here. So there was a big debate in whether it was right to kill them or not, and later they tried to cover up what happened, and they told teachers not to teach about the issue, and they took it out of textbooks. And I learned that in America, sometimes we've done things that we're not proud of, and instead of learning from those, we tend to just cover it up. And I think that we could learn from this by moving forward with our mistakes and learning to accept everyone. So, yeah.
So my goal for this research project was to find continuities in American foreign policy since the early republic. Originally, my primary source was going to be the founding statements of the American Colonization Society. But upon doing some research, I found that the Monroe Doctrine is actually a remarkably consistent cornerstone of American political thought and rhetoric. Every generation has dealt with the Monroe Doctrine, but has grappled with it in a different way. And so what I do in my paper is I sort of go through the different phases our nation goes through in interpreting the Monroe Doctrine. So initially what the Monroe Doctrine is when James Monroe issues the Monroe Doctrine, it is during a State of the Union address. He talks about many subjects in it. He never could have known that the Monroe Doctrine would have grown to be as important of a doctrine as it is today. But basically, Latin American nations are breaking away from Spain. There's these new countries coming up, and he's worried that European powers will, much stronger than Spain, will come and take over and feast on sort of the carcasses of these fractured nations. And so he issues this statement where he says, we're not interested in being involved in the wars of Europe, but if you come to try to colonize any country on the Western Hemisphere, you are, that is a direct act of aggression against the United States. Now, initially, this doctrine is seen as rather inconsequential because we really don't have the capacity to do anything to European powers. We really aren't that strong. The first time we actually act on the Monroe Doctrine is in the Mexican-American War. We invoke the Monroe Doctrine when we take Texas away from Mexico. And the reason we invoke the Monroe Doctrine there is because we say Texas is too vulnerable, it's too easy to manipulate, it will be an opening for a European power to come and establish power on this continent, and we can't have that. So we take it from Mexico. Other important developments are certainly Theodore Roosevelt's interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine, which is essentially we have the capability to do whatever we want to Latin American nations as long as what we're doing prevents European powers from coming. Then you have Woodrow Wilson's interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine, which is anything that we can do to help fellow nations is necessary. And finally, the framework that Woodrow Wilson lays of trying to be involved in as many conflicts as you can to try to make a better world eventually leads to the Cold War and the War on Terror, where the United States is overspreading, is trying to nation build, and is sort of going beyond the boundaries of the original Monroe Doctrine, which is just the Western Hemisphere. And we are now trying to promote liberty and safety across the world. Successfully? We'll find out.
Y'all take a bow in front of the camera and say goodbye to Collins.
Just kidding. That's it. Thanks for listening.